Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at our four main categories of the tissues that can be found in our body. This is also known as histology whenever we describe or discuss or study tissue types. So the four types of tissue that can be found in our body are connective tissue, nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, and muscular tissue. Now, generally said, each of these tissue have these general functions associated with them. For instance, the nervous tissue function is to create and respond to stimuli using nerve impulses. And when we talk about muscular tissue, they typically means contraction, which creates some sort of movement. When we talk about connective tissue, we're talking about connecting or binding or supporting the rest of the body structures and tissues. And lastly, epithelial tissue basically would be covering the surface of the hollow organs or the surface of the body. So what we're going to look at next is what are the subclassification within these four major groups of tissue. We're going to start by looking at the connective tissue. So the connective tissue is one of the more complex of the tissues. It is identified as, again, in terms of job, responsible for binding and holding and supporting the rest of the body structures. Now, for us to understand the connective tissue, I want you guys to understand that there are multiple groups within that, and I'm going to actually do a quick demo for you guys so you guys can see what this breakdown looks like. So when we're talking about connective tissue, so CT is going to be shorthand for connective tissue. We're going to have three main branches within that. We can have supportive, we can have fluid, and we can have what we consider to be proper. So supportive basically implies that they're going to provide support for our body. And the main type that you will see under supportive would be your bone and your cartilage. So cartilage itself has three types. Now, we're not necessarily going to discuss every single possibility here, but it is good for you guys to at least hear the names. So we have hyaline cartilage. We have what we identify as elastic cartilage. And the third category is referred to as fibro cartilage. In terms of fluid, we have two main groups as well. One group is your blood. Yes, blood is connective tissue. And the other one is identified as lymph, which is associated with lymphatic tissue. For proper, we have two main categories. The main categories are identified as either loose or dense. Loose proper include your adipose tissue. If you ever heard of fat tissue, the word adipose may have been presented itself. We have your an areolar tissue. And again, this is the only two types that I really want to focus on for you guys. Even though there are other branches of that, these are the ones that I want you guys to focus on. And dense actually has two types. We have regular and irregular. And again, I'm not going to go into details about these as much, but it is good for you guys to know that. While I'm doing that, let me add this group as well, which is called reticular connective tissue. And we're not going to review all of them, but some of this connective tissue is what our focus is going to be on. So one of the things that I need you guys to know is that the connective tissue, there are certain components that are going to be present. You're always going to have a specialized cells present. There are, of course, exceptions. We have what we identify as ground substance, which is basically the area or the environment the cells are placed inside. Now, that environment could be solid, like you see in the bone. It could be more gel-like material, more like cartilage, or it could be liquid, like what you see in blood. And then you will also see a lot of protein fibers. So protein fibers are basically these long extensions that have different thickness. They could be collagen fiber, reticular fiber, or elastic fibers. Now, again, I don't want you guys to know a lot of details about them. I don't need you guys to know functions for each of these protein fibers. It's more of the concept of familiarity with the terminology. So let's look at the connective tissue. So connective tissue, we have used the word fibrous here, but the word fibrous is actually another way of saying it would be proper, as I mentioned earlier. And in this case, I have depicted 3 of the main type of connective tissues that we have in terms of proper. The first one is your areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is the most common type of connective tissue we have. It is a protective layer between your muscle and your skin. And again, kind of imagining the surface area of your body, areolar tissue would be the most common. The second tissue is depicted, which kind of looks like a lot of bubbles, like air bubbles, right? This is your adipose tissue, which is basically your fat tissue. The specific cells that are associated with that, and I'm going to highlight this for you guys or underline it for you, is adipocyte. Again, adipo implies fat, cyte means cells. So each of these blobs that you see right here, each of them are identifying a fat cell. The space you see empty at the center, that's basically the space would be filled with fat. A location where you can find, which is something that I do want you guys to remember, is under your skin. You can also find it around some of your organs, like your heart and kidney. You of course have them as a way of storing fat. So you have abdominal fat, for instance. So these are basically the most common places you can find this adipose tissue. The next type of tissue that we have depicted here is our dense connective tissue. The picture that we're depicting for you is dense regular, so you can add the word regular to it. If you wonder why the word regular comes into play, is if you look at the protein fibers, see how beautifully they're organized going parallel to each other? So this parallel pattern that we see here makes this type of tissue as regular. If we were looking at dense irregular connective tissue, and then what we would see is a very irregular pattern. The lines would be all over the place, and that would make this dense irregular connective tissue. So as of right now, where can we find these dense, regular dense connective tissue? Best example would be in your tendons and then ligaments. If you're unfamiliar with the vocabulary, the tendons are basically a connection point for muscles and bones, versus ligaments is a point of connection between bone to bone. And you hear these words later on in the muscular system and the skeletal system. Now, when we're talking about the connective tissue, another category that we discussed was supportive connective tissue. So for the supportive connective tissue, we mentioned that is including bone and cartilage. So the cartilage, we mentioned that 3 different types. We have elastic, we have hyaline, and we have fibrocartilage. So hyaline cartilage is what you see right here. If you notice the background, that pink background is very glossy looking, and it's not, doesn't have anything in the background, basically. It's a very clean, clear background. What you see here at the center, these little circles right here, these are the structures that contain your cells or your cartilage cells, and they're identified as chondrocytes. Again, break down the word for yourself, chondro and cyte. Chondro means cartilage and cyte means cell, right? So this basically means cartilage cells. Elastic cartilage is what is depicted here. Again, you will see still those kind of circles which are containing your chondrocytes. However, the background is not very clean, right? You have a lot of background which are basically your protein fibers. And that's how we identify your elastic cartilage. Next type, you have these fibrocartilages, which are depicted on the bottom picture. Again, these kind of darker spots that you see throughout them, those would be your chondrocytes, as it's highlighted here. And what you see as kind of these kind of wavy patterns of blue lines going through those would be your protein fibers. Now again, you still, because all of these are cartilage cells, the cells would be referred to as chondrocytes. The location of each of these cartilages are different. For instance, hyaline cartilage can be found in the nose, in the end of your long bones. Fetal skeleton always starts with hyaline cartilage. You can see this later on as well. Elastic cartilage implies that they are very elastic. So best example would be your ear. If you ever heard of a structure called epiglottis, this is also made up of elastic cartilage. You'll see this later on in the respiratory system. And then fibrocartilage is basically the disc between your vertebra. So if you have looked at your vertebra, here is the bones that form your vertebral column. The spaces between them is a cartilage called fibrocartilage. So if you have heard people have back pain as a result of a disc problem, basically that's what they're talking about. Another connective tissue that is considered supportive is your bone. So there are actually two types of bone, a spongy bone and compact bone. So in this picture, what I'm depicting you is the macroscopic anatomy, which is basically what we visibly can see looking at the bone. You can see a lot of holes and opening inside of this. That makes it the spongy bone. And then these areas where you have seen this kind of dense, compact structure of bones, this is referred to as the compact bone. Now, if I take a slice of the compact bone and put it under the microscope, this is what it looks like. The compact bone is made up of these circular units right here, as I see here. These circular units are identified as osteons, as it's labeled here. And these darker spots that you see inside of them, these are referred to as osteocytes. Again, looking at the word, guys, if you have remember the root words, osteo means bone, and again, cyte means cell. So osteocytes simply means bone cells. Where can we find a spongy bone and compact bone? Spongy bones, as you can see here, are usually at the end of the bones, versus compact bones are found in surrounding your limbs. If you're wondering what is the bone that is depicted here, in this picture, that is the femur, which is the thigh bone. Now, the third category of connective tissue is blood. Blood is the fluid category of your connective tissue. What you need to know about them is that there are 3 types of cells found inside your blood as the connective tissue. Majority of the cells you can see are these pink circles. These are identified as your red blood cells, also shorthand to RBC. Another name for them is erythrocyte. Erythro means red, cyte means cell. These larger structures typically stain purple with a very pronounced nucleus inside of them. Those are your white blood cells, and also shorthand to WBC, and they also can be called leukocytes. And then you have these kind of what looks like fragments or background dirt. These are what we identify as your platelets. Now, what is the function of each of these 3 components? Red blood cells are essential in transporting oxygen. White blood cells are essential in basically defending your body against infective agents like bacteria and viruses. Platelets are essential in forming blood clots if you have damaged a blood vessel. And as I mentioned here, they're not complete cells, and you'll learn about them more when we look at our blood lecture later on in the course. Now, moving on to our muscular tissue. We have mentioned that there are 3 different types of muscle tissue. These are identified as a smooth, cardiac, and a skeletal muscle. So this chart is really important. It helps you guys understand some of the characteristics that distinguishes these 3 muscle categories. So a smooth muscle has these cell shapes that are kind of chunky in the middle, and as they go into either end, they thin out. They also refer to this shape as a spindle shape. Cardiac muscle is branched. So you notice that here is my cell starting, and it forms multiple branches and it spans throughout the tissue. And a skeletal is best described as cylindrical. So sometimes I just depict it as like something like this to kind of highlight the point. Now, what is another characteristic that distinguishes these cells? Is presence of striations. A striation easily described as stripes or lines of light and dark pattern. So if you look at this picture, there is no light or dark pattern inside this cell. However, if you look at your cardiac and your skeletal, you see the patterns of line going. And these patterns are identified as striation, which is again present in the cardiac and your skeletal cell. Next is the number of nuclei. Now, our typical understanding up to this point is you have a cell and each of these cells have a nucleus. That is true for majority of the cells. However, cells like your skeletal system, because of their size or length, they are cells that require multiple nuclei. So a skeletal muscle has typically contain 2 or more nuclei per cell. Cardiac muscle may get a little bit long and therefore may have between 1 to 2 nuclei per cell. However, smooth muscles are relatively short and they only contain 1 nuclei per cell. The next thing you can see is the type of movement created by each of these muscle categories. A smooth muscle is involuntary. Basically, that means that the movement of these muscles are not under my control. If that doesn't make sense, take a look at the location. Movement of your intestines is created by a smooth muscle. The iris of your eye that changes the size of your pupil is also made up of a smooth muscle. So think about it. Movement of your intestines that basically allow you to move your food through the digestive system and eventually remove the unwanted material is not under your control. If it was under your control, you never would have diarrhea or constipation, basically. Same thing with the iris of the eye. If you go into a bright room, your pupil will dilate because of your iris muscles, right? It is not something you control. Same thing with your cardiac muscle. The movement of the cardiac muscle is identified as involuntary. Cardiac implies your heart. So the only place that you can find cardiac muscle would be your heart. Again, you cannot make a conscious decision to increase or decrease your heart rate. However, the third category of muscle, which is my skeletal muscle, have the voluntary control, minus your reflexes, or with the exception of reflexes. So I can choose when to move my muscles. These are the muscles that are connected to my bones. For instance, I choose to bend my elbow. I choose to flex my biceps. I choose to move my knee, right? Or bend my knee. So all of these are voluntary motions, which means they are under my control, where I make the conscious decision to move them. Now, the next category I want to take a look at is your epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue are the ones that are either found lining the body cavities or the surface of the skin. If you're wondering where I can find it in terms of body cavities, They line your stomach, your lungs, your heart, your bladder, your intestines. Basically, any hollow organ you have in your body will contain epithelial tissue. Now, when you name epithelial tissue, you need to keep in mind that it has two-part name. It has a first name and it has a last name. The first name is based on the cell shape. So what does that mean? If I have cells that are relatively flat, okay, we refer to these as squamous cells. If the cells are more cube-shaped, we call them cuboidal. And if these cells are elongated with a particular shape, they're referred to as columnar cells. So when you look at this picture, I can first identify what is the shape of the cell will give us the basically part of the name. The second part of our name is how many layers do I have? So if I have a single layer of these cells, doesn't matter which of the type, I will refer to them as simple. And if I have two or more layers, doesn't matter if it's 10, 20, 30, as far as it's two or more layers, I will identify them as stratified. So when I'm naming my epithelial tissue, I always start with identifying the number of layers, and then that is followed by the shell shape of my cell. Let me give you an example. If I have a single layer of flattened cells, I will identify that as simple squamous. If I have multiple layers of cube-shaped cells, I identify that as stratified cuboidal. So here is a few pictures of that. So if you're talking about simple squamous, notice again, single layer of cells. These cells are relatively flattened, right? So see the flattened cells, right? And it's a single layer, nothing is stacked up. So that's simple squamous. The best place for it is your lung tissue. Simple cuboidal, again, notice that these cells are single layer, somewhat cube-shaped cell. That's found in your kidneys. And this last one, notice the cells, again, kind of long or elongated cells. These would be identified as my simple columnar. Best example for their location would be our intestines. If I have many layers of flattened cells stacked on top of each other, they're identified as stratified squamous. If I have two or more layers of cube-shaped cells, stratified cuboidal, and multiple lines of cells that are elongated, that's a stratified columnar. Best example for stratified squamous is your skin. Best example for stratified cuboidal is salivary gland, and for stratified columnar would be urethra. So what we would be looking at in terms of your lab, this is one of the ones we're going to look at, as well as these three possibilities. The reason we will not look at the last two, which is the stratified cuboidal and columnar, is because they are relatively rare in our body, and therefore you will not require to know them for our level of the class. Last type of tissue that we have are referred to as neural tissue. Neural tissue are found within our nervous system, and they are responsible for creating nerve impulses for the purpose of communication. Now, the most common type of cells that we can find in a neural tissue are your neurons and the supporting cells. So, the picture is depicted here is your neuron. Here's a neuron, and here is an actual picture under the microscope. So you have these long extensions of your neuron called dendrites. You have this central body called cell body. And you have one long extension called the axon. So in these pictures, these extensions right here, these ones, these ones, these ones, this and this and this, are your dendrites. This central body right here is your cell body. And this one long extension coming out in the back would be your axon. What else I want you guys to know is that there is a lot of these tiny structures surrounding these neurons. These are identified as the supporting cells. And the job of these cells is basically support the neuron in terms of functionality and survival. Even though neuron is carrying the actual function, they will not be able to accomplish the job without their supporting cells. So for the activity of this lab, I will give you some pictures, and I do require you guys to be able to take a look at the picture, and based on the knowledge I have given you, first be able to identify the tissue type, and then also be able to provide an example of the location of where each of these tissues can be found.